Hi, this is Ashish R. Pedekar, and welcome to my podcast, The ARB Show. My guest for this inaugural episode is Himanshu. In fact, there's a very funny backstory to this. A few years ago, I gave a talk at Palava Smart City Accelerator near Mumbai. It was well received, and for some reason, Himanshu missed it. And because I think he stays in Palava Smart City, and then he reached out to me on LinkedIn later on. We had a good discussion, we had a good chat, and then he invited me to be on his podcast show called Lifestyle Architecture Lab. And while we were recording, after the recording, I said that he would be my first guest I talk to whenever I start a podcast. And here we are. Welcome, Himanshu. Do introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi Ashish. Good to be here on this platform with you. So I'm also glad that we are doing this after a couple of years when you initially had been on my podcast. So as you mentioned that I missed the presentation that you were doing in Palava. So I also have a little bit backstory to it that when I was doing my podcast, Lifestyle Architecture Labs, I was reaching out to a lot of people at that time, and Mr. Lodha, who is the MD of the Lodha developers. So I was trying to reach out to him, and while doing the research, for his interview, so I somehow stumbled upon your talk there, and I thought I'll be there, but somehow, unfortunately, I couldn't be. But serendipity is such that we connected there on LinkedIn. I reached out to you for the podcast because I found your talk pretty interesting, for which I got the notes afterwards. So that was a little bit on the backstory which you shared about. And as for my introduction, as you have already mentioned that I do a podcast called Lifestyle Architecture Lab. So before the podcast, the blog I had started in 2013-14, almost in nearly 10 years now, since I've been blogging. So my main thing is, I'm a writer. So I write and I do blogging and I do podcasting. And podcasting originated from, another podcast which I fondly, am subscribed to, which is the Tim Ferriss Show. I find him pretty fascinating and all his work, as he has been touching a lot of bases on his podcast. So I I inspired to be like him. So that is where the podcast for me started, and our paths also crossed. So yeah,
Great.
glad to be here.
Great. And your work life, I think you're a fintech professional. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah. So in my daytime job, I am a IT professional, and basically working on fraud solutioning for fintechs and banks, and also involved in solutioning of anti-money laundering kind of solutions. So that is my full-time job, but on the different tangent. So I do the writing part and blogging and podcasting. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Himanshu. And as we discussed, what I would like this podcast format is where the guests talk about top three do's and top three don'ts on a specific topic. So here I would invite you to talk about top three do's and don'ts on starting a podcast. And I'm sure it will be useful for the audience as much as it's useful for me, because this, again, as I said, is the inaugural show. And thanks to your tips and guidance, I've kind of tried to incorporate it in many ways. Also, as we discussed, we have created a presentation based on your kind of talk, and we'll include it in the show notes. Over to
Sure.
Himanshu. Maybe let's start with the do's first.
Yeah, sure. So I have a few points which we can consider as do, and these are mainly based on my personal experience. While doing my own podcast. So the first one, and the most important one, which I would like to share here is be in the moment while doing the podcast, and more so while recording the podcast. So if you are in the conversation, so you have to be in the conversation. So don't be distracted with something. So you have to actively achieve an environment where you are distraction free while recording, and while doing the homework for the podcasting. So you should be clear headed, and while recording specifically, you should be in a specific room, and engaged with the guest if you are doing the interview kind of podcast, or if it is a different kind of podcast where you are discussing some topics. So there also you have to be very clear and concise on what you are talking about, and be respectful about your topic and your guests as well, by being in the moment. So that is the number one thing which I would like to share.
Great. I think that's a very valid observation. And I think I've read a famous quote by Ernest Hemingway, where he says that when people talk, listen completely. And because he said most people never listen. I think even in regular life, I think that's a very valid observation to do. So what would be your second do?
Second do would be to do your homework. If you are working with guests specifically, then because they are also providing you the time, and time is money, as we all know. So be very honest with the homework which you are doing. So if, for example, if you are doing a podcast with a writer who has a book coming out, so maybe they might be interested in value exchange, that you share their book, and they will become your guest on your podcast. So in that sense, you have to read out their book. So it should not be like that you are just surfing around the book and not doing your homework, and also learn more facts about them, and your notes should be full with that, first of all. And if you are not doing guest work, it is just a topic, there you should have very detailed research done on the topic which you are going to discuss. So the second thing will be the homework which you need to do. Yeah, so that's it.
Great. I mean, that's so true. There's nothing like over preparation and things like that. That's great. Now coming to the third do.
Yeah. So third do should be, in my opinion, in the beginning when you are starting out a podcast, you should measure your success. It may not look like success in the beginning because numbers are pretty scarce in the podcasting world in the beginning. So you have to have a plan, like 6 months plan, where you are consistently putting out content, episodes, and you are continuously monitoring how it is going, and more so with the modern stats which are available with the hosts like anchor.fm, or maybe River FM, these kind of services. So I'm sorry. So with them, we should have a look at the stats in a deeper detail, what kind of things listeners are most interested in different episodes, and in each episode as well, at which part they are more interested. So all those things which we should consider, and put more efforts to make that graph go up in the beginning, at least, so that when you stabilize with a good amount of audience, post that you can slowly start to come down on that, because later on it won't matter if you have got 1 lakh downloads per month. So in the beginning, measure your success. That would be the third one.
Very valid. And in fact, as they say, what can't be measured can't be improved. So that was good. I think top three were really very valid. Now moving on to the don'ts, because don'ts are equally important as do's.
Yeah. So one thing I learned about doing these interview shows was, if you are speaking with a guest, don't cut them in between. It is kind of a skill which we need to hone as the hosts, because what happens is, if we are speaking and sometimes we get pretty excited while speaking to somebody, and we don't even think about that they are actually opening up and sharing the topic. So while we overstep that boundary, so they might resist back and not share what they could have shared. So the could have shared things are pretty interesting, which sometimes get cut out because the hosts overstep. So that would be the first don't cut the guests while they're speaking.
Right. I think very true. So the second don't, what would you think it is?
So I think the second don't would be related to the do's. One of the those points uh, that, as I mentioned, do your homework, right? So a don't would be, don't let your guest come underprepared or unprepared. So while you are doing any guest kind of show, where your interview kind of show rather, where a guest is coming up, so you have to prepare them as well, because it is kind of a subtle dance, right? The podcasting. So your guest and the host both should be in line, and they should engage with each other in a pretty subtle way. So you have to inform them about what would you like to do on the show, on the episode, and what would you like them to do, and what kind of mic placement will be there for them, if you are meeting in person, or if you are doing it remotely, like we are doing. So you can pre-inform them that this is something you need to do, or you need to be in a closed environment where somebody would not barge in suddenly on you. So all those things, you need to have some homework done for your guests as well, because not all guests are techies and nerds, who can take care of their own recording sessions. So that would be the second point.
Right. I mean, all these points have been very useful for me personally. And in fact, that's a good idea. And I would definitely send an email to future guests on what to expect with details of the show format, right? So they're at comfort and it doesn't come as a surprise. Now, coming to the last, third don't. Yeah.
The third don't would be that, specifically in the beginning, don't wait for your audience to come to you. It would be a pretty big mistake, that you are putting out content, you are putting out the podcast. First of all, definitely, if somebody is working out so hard to put the podcast out, they won't do this mistake. But sometimes we just go with the flow, and don't put effort in reaching the audience truly. So you have to make efforts, like you need to tell your guests as well that you need to share the podcast afterwards, or you have all the social media platforms where you could have the reach already, or you may not have the reach, but still whatever reach you have got, you need to share the podcast with the audience, and try to uh, see if somebody bigger than you can share your podcast in some way, specifically in the beginning. So platforms like LinkedIn, where the corporate clout is useful, and on Twitter side, it's like mostly people are Twitter people are too smart, so you have to share it on Twitter as well. And lastly, Facebook is old school, but a lot of traffic comes through Facebook. On the other side, if you have an email newsletter, so you should share your podcast on the email newsletter as well. And the mouth to mouth publicity is also one old school thing which we could do, and share with our WhatsApp groups, or maybe speak about it with our friends and try to reach more audience. So the third don't is, don't wait for the audience to come to you. You have to reach out to them in the beginning, for sure.
Great. I think thanks, Himanshu. I think it's great perspectives, and I personally would use this advice, and I'm sure our our audience would also use this very sage advice. So
Great.
that's it for this episode, dear listeners. Thank you for tuning in. And the presentation in the show call notes will have Himanshu's social media handles and the bonus content, which you should definitely check. And this includes some of his podcast recommendations. So bye for now. Talk to you soon.